We have been fed lies in order to keep one thing consistent: identity crisis. This was by design. Otherwise, why have we not heard more of the true origin of the name of California? It is named after a magnificent black Moorish queen. By Moor, I mean indigenous enlightened melanated peoples. I don't think our current culture can truly understand how enlightened the indigenous races of these lands were. The prevailing American culture in the youth today revolves around demeaning women, money, and the lust for power. Our ancestors would not only be embarrassed, but disappointed in how lost we have become. Specifically, the indigenous Moors inhabiting what was left of Mu, or what is known in the Spanish legend as the island of California, were known for their grand psychic abilities. The females ruled as their psychic and mental abilities were far superior than the males. They were master shamans as they could navigate between realms at will, something our modern culture can't even begin to comprehend. The closest topics that we have is dreams, astral projection, but these concepts still don't fully explain to the modern mind the full dynamic of what these ancient lands were like. Now, I have to start this off as if you've never watched a video on this channel. However, there are more videos on the channel that break down the lie of history if you wish to see it explained further. This is more of a sequel to the understanding that our entire history is a lie. Many have heard of the theory of Tartaria by now, but in short, the history we are fed in the education systems are a falsity. A lie designed to keep us enslaved, enslavement through identification crisis. They have taught us to identify ourselves with monkeys, that all human beings originate from Africa, that we evolved through fear and survival, as our consciousness mysteriously forms through some type of physical means. The origin that we are given, of course, is but a random explosion of nothing. They then give us false, soulless history. But many of us know that there's something more. Deep in our subconscious, we know the stories of Atlantis and advanced ancient civilizations. It's a part of our collective memory. We are taught that we had a linear progress of evolution when the truth of the matter is that there have been multiple cataclysms in the past. We know of this too. Everyone knows of the story of the flood. It is the most known story in the world. That kind of trauma would never go away within our psyches. Yet, that would mean that we de-evolved, that we were once great nations who had achieved peace and saw past the boundaries of race ratios. We developed advanced spiritual practices and had truly reached the golden age. Many technologies existed that would be hard for the modern man to imagine possible. In this day, we have lost our sovereignty, our minds, our sense of divinity. We have been fed materialism from our birth. The spirit in many of our people are dwindling, but this is the age of awakening. In the official timeline that they give us, the fall of Rome is 2,000 years ago. It's very difficult in a short segment to fully explain everything, especially the timeline, but the way I would put it is that these ancient architectures that we call Greco-Roman are actually from Atlantis, and Atlantis is likely not 13,000 years ago as Graham Hancock suggests. Remember, he believes that we came from monkeys. Atlantis is of a much more recent time, and what was part of what we now know as America. It's hard to comprehend the nature of this reality, and shocking to realize the drastic measures that have taken place in such a short period of time. Many scholars in the modern day have tried to create a new timeline, such as Fomenko and Isaac Newton. The origin of our modern timeline comes from a man named Scaliger. This is where we get our mainstream timeline, but many debate that this is a falsity created by a specific religious group. This group falsified history in order to make it seem as if they have the most ancient religion. For Black people, the most ancient depiction comes from ancient Irish legends, the Fomorians, a great civilization of great stature who had grand occult abilities. From Donnelly's Atlantis, quote, "The Fomorians were from Atlantis. They were called Fomoraic, Fomorag Afriic, and Fomorag, which has been rendered into English as Fomorians. They possess ships, and the uniform representation is that they came, as the name Fomorag Afriic indicated, from Africa. But in that day, Africa did not mean the continent of Africa as we now understand it. Major Wilford, in the 8th volume of the Asiatic Researches, has pointed out that Africa comes from Apar, Aphar, Apara, or Aparika, terms used to signify the West, just as we now speak of the Asiatic world as the East. When, therefore, the Fomorians claimed to come from Africa, they simply meant that they came from the west, in other words, from Atlantis. Now, it is said from these ancient legends that the Fomorians were a warlike race, and that they caused great havoc in the world. These are the times when Atlantis was beginning to fall. War was happening constantly. From Donnelly's Atlantis, quote, "The Irish annals speak of the Fomorians as a warlike race, who, according to the annals of Clon MacNoise, were a sept descended from Ham, the son of Noah, and lived in piracy and spoiled of the nations, and were in those days very troublesome to the whole world. Were not these the inhabitants of Atlantis who, according to Plato, carried their arms to Egypt and Athens, and whose subsequent destruction had been attributed to divine vengeance invoked by their arrogance and oppressions?" Quote, "The Fomorians were a civilized race. They had a fleet of 60 ships and a strong army. They were basically ancient sea pirates, and some were giants, up to 12 feet tall. They were one of the first explorers of Ireland before the destruction of Atlantis." Quote, "They possessed Ireland from so early a period that by some of the historians, they are spoken of as the Aborigines of the country. The first invasion to the country was by the Basque people, or the Atlantis settlements in Spain. Many of you may think that this is fantasy, but this is common knowledge in mainstream history. How many black people today in America know that Ireland is an integral part of their history? Not many. Quote, "The Fomorians defeated Partholon's people, the Basque from Spain, killed Partholon, and drove the invaders out of the country. The next invader to their dominions was Nimhid. He captured one of their fortifications, but it was retaken by the Fomorians under Mort. Nimhid was driven out of the country, and the Atlanteans continued in undisturbed possession of the island, the Fomorians, for 400 years more." So what else do we have? Well, we have legends of ancient Lemuria, the ancestral homeland of black peoples. In H.P. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, quote, "There's a period of a few million of years to cover between the first mindless race and the highly intelligent and intellectual later Lemurians." Now, before we continue, let me just say that I don't agree with her timeline or completely concur with her views on the Theosophical Society. According to the story, she obtained this information from an ancient book that she had access to that is not exposed to the public. Quote, "Madame Blavatsky claimed to have seen a manuscript of the Book of Zion when studying esoteric lore in Tibet. She claimed this and other ancient manuscripts were safeguarded from profane eyes by the initiates of an occult brotherhood. Many of the lands of Lemuria still exist today, such as Australia, New Zealand, Madagascar, and even parts of America such as California. Quote, "They, the Lemurians, built huge cities of rare earths and metals. They built out of the fires lava vomited, out of the white stone of the mountains marble, and the black stone of the subterranean fires they cut their own images in their size and likeness and worshipped them. The Lemurians were a spiritual race of black giants. They were a mix of Mongolian and black and had different organs according to Blavatsky. It is said that they had a physical eye on the back of their head, and that this degenerated into the now called third eye, and that they were the grand magicians of the elements. Quote, "This is the reason why perhaps even Easter Island with its wondrous gigantic statues, a speaking witness to a submerged continent with a civilized mankind on it. This is why many Aborigines from the lands around the Pacific Ring of Fire are of a dark complexion. The pure blood of black peoples come from this ancestral homeland of Lemuria. The remnants of this land is in California. The old maps show California as an island because Mu went through many stages. It began to merge with the mainland of terra firma as parts of the western coast began to sink. In the occult tradition, root races are basically different versions of the human body, in connection with different ages. The first root race was said to be completely ethereal. The second root race had more physical bodies and spawned in Hyperborea. The third root race, the form that we now truly recognize as human, existed on the lost continent of Lemuria. And the fourth root race developed into Atlantis. According to the occult tradition, this isn't all done simply by sexual reproduction. The first root race, the Polarians, from the center pole of our realm, were completely androgynous beings. This esoteric lore is prevalent through the Hellenes as we hear this from Plato. They had the process of asexual reproduction. This changes as it is said that races can manifest into this reality without budding, but through some type of coming down from above or spirit spawning process. As these races developed from spirit and continued their progress through the ages, everything is being recorded into the Akashic records. This affects the next races to come in the coming ages. There were many colonies of Atlantis. We know of one colony today, such as the Olmecs, was a place where many cultures came and traded. These are the Atlantean races, and I'm not 100% sure how the first two are pronounced, but we have number 1, the Romahal, number 2, the Tlavati, number 3, Toltec, 4, First Turanian, 5, Original Semite, 6, Akkadian, 7, Mongolian. Quote, thus the first Atlantean races born on the Lemurian continent separated from their earliest tribes into the righteous and the unrighteous, into those who worshipped the one unseen spirit of nature, the ray of which man feels within himself, or the pantheist, and those who offered fanatical worship to the spirits of the earth, the dark cosmic, anthropomorphic powers, Saturn, with whom they made alliance. It is important to remember that sometimes races did overlap and change both in time frames lived or remnants of them survived in the areas occupied. It should also be remembered that in some cases, a catastrophe was anticipated by the priest more in tune with higher energies, and many migrations into lands currently in existence took place before all of Atlantis was submerged. There was intermarrying not only among the subraces of Atlantis, but also with the remains of Lemurian subraces who had escaped before the fiery end of Lemuria. The first subrace, quote, the Romahals were a dark race, their complexion being a sort of mahogany black. Their height in these early days was about 10 or 12 feet, truly a race of giants. But through the centuries, their stature gradually dwindled, as did that of all races in turn, and later on we shall find that they had shrunk to the stature of a fur-fused man. They ultimately migrated to the southern shores of Atlantis, where they were engaged in constant warfare with the 6th and 7th subraces of the Lemurians then inhabiting that country. A large part of the tribe eventually moved north, while the remainder settled down and intermarried with these black Lemurian aborigines. The second subrace, the Tlavatli, originated on an island off the west coast of Atlantis. They were a strong race, not as tall as the Romahal, with reddish-brown skin. They were a mountain-loving people who, along with the third subrace, the Toltecs, inhabited the western island which formed part of what is now known as the American continent. The Toltecs, the third subrace, stood about 8 feet tall and had reddish-brown skin, like the Tlavatli, but more coppered colored. The features of the Toltecs, according to William Scott Elliott, were straight and well-marked, not unlike the ancient Greeks. The Toltecs ruled the entire continent of Atlantis peacefully for thousands of years. The Turanians, the fourth subrace, originated on the eastern side of the continent. They were yellow-skinned humans who were never a dominant race on the mother continent, though some of their tribes and family races became fairly powerful. The fifth subrace were the Semites, who had their home on the northeastern part of a peninsula which is now Scotland and Ireland. They were a disconnected race, always warring with their neighbors and maintaining their independence from the southern kings. The sixth subrace, the Akkadians, came into existence after the first great disaster. Born on a peninsula further south of the Semites, the Akkadians quickly migrated to the much larger continent of Atlantis. They fought and overcame the original Semites, ruling Atlantis for several hundred years. The Mongolians, the seventh subrace, had no touch with the mother continent. They were developed from the descendants of the Turanians. They spread over what is now Asia. Master Kut Humi and the Mahatma letters wrote that the modern Oriental races such as the Chinese, Mongolian, Tibetan, Malaysian, Indonesian, Japanese, Vietnamese, and so on are largely descended from the seventh and final subrace of the Atlantean root race. Quote, the Lemuro-Atlanteans built cities and spread civilization, the incipient stage of anthropomorphism. Their statues witness to the size of the Lemuro-Atlanteans. Lemuria destroyed by fire, Atlantis by water, the flood. The destruction of the fourth race and of the last antediluvian monster animals. By monster animals, there were many creatures that used to exist that were truly evil, and we hear stories of this in every culture around the world, or in some type of flood myth, and great mythical creatures that would terrorize the city. After each age, the continents change quite drastically. Continents sink and rise. Comets come and do impossible movements in the sky, unexplainable by modern science, and causes cataclysms and destruction by fire. The myths say that the gods were to blame, as they watched over and judged us as we passed through the ages. We must understand that the continents shifted quite drastically within the last 1,000 years, as it explains the supposed cartographic errors of the maps from the 16th and 17th century. Notice that most of our maps stop around the 1400s, and this date may even be made up from most of these documents. These new rulers, who were planning to conquer and create a new world, who came from the Phoenician subrace, were masters of the sea and became the world's first global corporation. They became the hidden hand behind all the global master elite. They conquered Spain as the Castiles, manifesting as the Catholic Jesuits, then becoming the Venetians, the hidden hand beneath all public education and science, teaching a new cosmology of Saturn worship. This group worshipped the sun, but we have more than one sun and they shift. In this interpretation, our neighboring planets are suns. This is basic occult knowledge explained in a modern way. But basically, one of these cataclysms that led to the destruction of the great Church of Iessa, the destruction of all great Moorish civilizations, and the remaining empires in the world, done through some type of ritual of Baal, in which Saturn could be summoned into this physical world. The Phoenicians worshipped Baal in a way that we could never imagine. A good reference is The Adventures of Captain Mago, a Phoenician expedition 1000 BC, if you want to understand their want for control. Now, this is written from our modern timeline perspective, but what needs to be said is that these elites changed the calendar system and their own age. They added 1,000 years. So imagine that the fall of Rome is pushed forward 1,000 years on our mainstream timeline. You can trace Freemasonry back to this Phoenician cult. The Phoenicians belonged to the Aryan root race, so originally they were very renowned people. However, they fell to materialism in their quest to dominate the world market. What happened was there were still more powerful empires in the world that posed a threat to the Phoenicians. Many really. The Moors, the Tartarians, the Ottoman Empire, and the Church of Iessa, also known as the Druids, the original Hebrews. They needed to destroy the rest of the Aryans if they wanted to rule the next coming age. Which, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned, but they don't all die. It is said that the Atlanteans still exist. Same for the Hyperboreans, for they do not age. So that may just be part of it, is that the Phoenicians got access to this ancient knowledge of esoteric wisdom, and they took advantage of it. They prepared devices for surviving underwater, hence the symbolism of the mermaid prevalent in their culture and the worship of the conch. Either way, they survived this event and immediately began educating and creating the new world. Historical figures were made up completely. All the knowledge that we have is from the main school in Venice, from the Phoenicians who became the Venetians. These Jesuits then conquered through Spain and Britain. This version of Spanish is the Jesuit Spanish tongue, Castilian Spanish. The royal Castile family is a branch of the Phoenician chain, as you can see with the royal arms. Just look at the royal arms of all these families and you will clearly see who's in charge. They took old kings and renamed them and gave them new dates. The Library of Alexandria, containing the knowledge of all ages before, was burned. This group sought out the remaining knowledge in the world through the Knights Templar, burning the sacred esoteric knowledge of all the nations. In Plato's Timaeus, Solon, a Hellene, goes to one of the colonies in Egypt known as Sais. Based on its description, Plato presents the priests to be a darker complexion. These people are not exactly the purebloods from Lemuria, but a mixed race with multiple shades from dark brown to light brown with slight variations of hue, mostly red, said to be descended from the Tolmecs. There may have been some who had the strong blood from the Lemurian race with a dark black with bluish reflection, but they are not from these lands. We will soon see that there are many different races of people who lived in these lands. Now, for some context here, basically Solon took a trip to Sais and Egypt, and when Solon arrived, they greeted him with great honor. It seems that he wanted to share his knowledge, Solon, as if he was slightly boasting about his esoteric wisdom that he had recently learned. The priest is responding and telling him about a race of people who not only he didn't know about, but were a common ancestor of the two. Also, in terms of timeline and Plato, this could be ancient information or different books from the authors from the last age, compiled into one author, created by, you guessed it, the new rulers, Jesuit Phoenicians. I still think many of these books contain golden nuggets that they have left for those who seek wisdom. The only thing is, remember, they are trying to date this as if this process took 8,000 years. They adjusted the age in the translation based on the new knowledge at the time that this was translated. This is also where Blavatsky bases a lot of her history, including Tibetan and Hindu philosophies, so you can see how these made-up figures of the church could have influenced both science and occult circles. So now we fast forward to the lie of the Civil War. The plan was to create a new Atlantis, but there were still great civilizations living in the Americas. At this point in time now, the Venetians had conquered California through the Spanish and the northeast of America through the English, but large portions of the Midwest, especially in the Grand Canyon, were still occupied by a great race. Giants were still in America up to just 200, even 100 years ago, and still wouldn't be surprised if some are still remaining. We hear of these stories with like Lovelock Cave and the cannibalistic giants, but there's two theories here. One, that this is a cover-up to hide the great races that were living in America at the time. Or two, after the cataclysm of the sun, barbarism began along with tribalism. The great nations began to fall apart, and this is what led to the Venetians taking over large sections. But let's continue to the Civil War. And all around the point of 1812 is where this event took place, that let the Venetians finally take over America, or terra firma. In the history of almost every American city, something huge happens around this date. The movement of power, a treaty, a war, something, a fire, an earthquake. There was a huge event where the sun again disappeared and there was no summer for a few years. Now, throughout the ages, many cultures have made slaves of other races and or nations. It's happened since Lemuria. It did happen in America at one time during the fall of Atlantis, but the Aryan subraces did not enslave man, for they were noble men. The idea that slaves were brought over to America from Africa starts to become questionable. It wasn't until the 1812 period that the plan to rewrite history of America began, through the Jesuit empires of Spain, Britain, and France, in order to conquer the last remaining civilizations living in terra firma. They have you believe that black peoples, by the millions, were shipped from Africa to America, yet, if that were so, we would see well-preserved slave ships, but few are to be found and their genuineness are to be questioned after learning about this secret history. This name, African American, was offered many times and always rejected by the natives to these lands.
Because there's such a confusion about the people, and that was done deliberately, by bringing over a few 100,000 dark people from the Caribbean islands and possibly from the continent, by way of the Caribbean islands, bringing them here to these lands, creating this facade of everybody coming from the motherland instead of being from here. So there, it's created a massive ball of confusion, and this is not what they wanted to do. They wanted to be able to solidify this, that the Negro and the black man, you're from Africa, accepted a long time ago, but it wasn't accepted. As much as they tried to create it into acceptance through the Pan-Africanism. But so it's about identity. It's strictly about identity. Everything that we experience, black folk, lack of a term, white folk in this country.
Many natives of both North and South America were home to many indigenous black peoples, such as in New York, in Mexico, Wisconsin, in San Francisco, Southern California. They were in Mississippi, and in Oklahoma. This is a depiction of a black native from terra fire, or like we have mentioned earlier, terra firma, throughout South America. The Caribbean islands were home to the native black peoples. Black people have been on this land far before Christopher Columbus ever stepped foot, if he even existed. We have maps and depictions of Africa, with many towns and cities that seem to be castles. I also have shown you sources in the last chapter that most Egyptians were not of pure black Lemurian origin. So why are we fed this lie of Africa? It is to attach the identity of the native peoples of ancient America with a faraway land so that they may be enslaved mentally. This whole process was about erasing the last age, and these cultures were high civilizations that preserved the knowledge of the ages before. Therefore, the rulers that be forced the Spanish, English, and French nations to conquer these lands at all cost. They were funded by the same hidden hand, the first new global corporation, also known in history as the East Indian Trading Company, the first global national corporation. The black people who were left in America posed a problem to these invading Jesuit nations because there were still many left, as this was their homeland, and as we know from the secret history and the legend of Calafia. The original Semites who traveled to America, or the Celts in America, were foreign travelers who were trying to escape this Akkadian Jesuit takeover. So where do we get this history of black slavery? Well, during the 1800 to 1812 period, the plan to create this illusion that black people came from Africa began. John Lynch, who was known for colonizing cities in America and naming it after himself, such as Lynchburg, Virginia, supposedly he immigrated from Ireland to Virginia and then somehow prospered. Now, John Lynch sent a letter stating a plan for civilizing these new Africans on the coast of Africa, and his plan was to populate it with blacks from America. Quote, that the benevolent society now established in England for the purpose of civilizing the Africans was set on foot by Granville Sharp, one of its active members, and he was stimulated thereto by a letter wrote by William Dillwyn a considerable time back requesting him to suggest a plan of such a society forming a colony for the purpose eventually of promoting the civilization of the Africans and receive subjects for such a colony from this country. Lynch's letter was inspired, sponsored, and altered from a woman named Anne Mifflin, a Quaker from Philadelphia. She was a part of one of these English groups colonizing in America as one of the many denominations of the Christian faith. They had struck treaties, or in other words, paid off or forced the indigenous leaders to give up their lands. The history books don't teach about these remaining empires in America during the 18th century. This plan was really a plan to wipe out the remaining threat of Aborigines and to create a false identity by shipping many blacks to Africa to create this society off the coast of Africa. They wanted to civilize these blacks or brainwash them into thinking like the Akkadian or mainstream history Phoenician brain. They transformed all the races into this reptilian survival and taught the worship of an exterior god. We became focused around property and materialism, and we lost our spiritual ways. All of the subraces of this epoch, not just black peoples, we are still in the Aryan epoch, and these Phoenician Akkadian leaders are still in control and have fed us the lie of history as we know it, academia. Anne Mifflin met in Lynchburg and made a plan with other invaders on plans to remove and suppress the black peoples of those colonies. They seemed to be having problems and they needed to stop it immediately for good this time. September 1810. Anne spoke with James Wood on shipping recently freed slaves from the South, or the new generation that had been trained to believe in a false history, were to relocate to an island named Bolama on the coast of West Africa. This plan was the beginning of the African American enslavement training. James Wood endorsed the plan. The many abolitionists who developed during this period were said to be against slavery, but this is just a setup. These people are the ones that enslaved them in the first place. It's like philanthropy. They wanted to make themselves seem like the redeemers, when all they did was completely brainwash and replace the sense of self with a foreign entity. The enslavement did happen, but it was simply a brainwashing process on the homeland. One of these abolitionists was Granville Sharp. He gave the illusion that he wanted to end the slave trade when he had part in creating it. Also, key to note that it is very possible that black people were moved around, such as from the Caribbean islands and maybe even a few from Africa. But the story that by the millions they came from Africa is extremely questionable. He took part with Anne Mifflin in creating the Sierra Leone Company, which is now the modern-day name for this area of Bolama. The Aborigines of these Lemurian Atlantean lands, now known today as America, were made slaves when the invading colonials arrived. These colonials themselves were brainwashed by the ruling church at that time. At this time, many of the people may have disagreed with what was going on, but through the funding of the church, manifesting as Spain, Britain, and France, these colonials devised a plan of entering terra firma and conquering the rest of the Americas. Spain knew of these lands before Columbus. That was the point of bringing up Calafia at the beginning. The Amethyst of Gaul legends go back to the 15th century or even earlier, supposedly. Thomas Jefferson did reply to this plan by Anne Mifflin and said that this would be the most desirable measure in which could be adopted for gradually drawing off the black population. He endorsed it and thought that it should be the highest priority for the United States to make an establishment off the coast of Africa. This plan was well received by the rest of these forming new colonies in America, and the plan began to remove and indoctrinate the remaining population of the Aborigines of this land. These abolitionists from the North did not care about black people at all, and that's another reason to consider why the Civil War is simply a farce. Common for his times, Jefferson believed blacks were inherently inferior to whites and thought it was best the two races remained segregated. Now remember, all these groups, the Spanish, the English, and the French, all spawned from this original Phoenician, Akkadian, Canaanites, worshippers of Baal, and yes, they were extremely racist towards all colored races. Identity crisis. Even beyond the colors of our skin, many of us were given false histories, and our homelands were forgotten. But on a greater scale, our spiritual identities were lost. A new age began where we forgot about our own structures and architecture and the very cities that we now currently all share in America. The colonials did not build these cities. The groundwork for all major cities was built upon an existing civilization. That is the secret that has been kept from our education in order to enslave mankind under an exterior god, the god of materialism and death, Saturn. Thank you for watching. We send this video out with love and passion. If you feel that you disagree, simply don't watch it or help educate us. These times are truly confusing. We wish you all the best on your journey, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?